When your night job brings you face to face with the unknown, survival becomes the only destination. Martin had worked as a rideshare driver for years. The night shifts were his favorite. Quieter roads, bigger tips, and the occasional interesting passenger. But there was one night he would never forget, one that made him question if he'd ever drive again. It started like any other Friday night. The app pinged with rides nonstop, ferrying people from bars to late-night diners and home again. Around midnight, as the streets began to empty, Martin got a request from an address just outside the city. The pickup point was a narrow, poorly lit road surrounded by fields. He hesitated, but it wasn't the first time someone had requested a ride from the middle of nowhere. He arrived a few minutes early, his headlights cutting through the darkness. No one was there. He double-checked the app to make sure he had the right location. Just as he was about to cancel the ride, he saw her. A woman stepped out from the shadows. She was tall, with long black hair and pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. She wore a flowing dress, entirely inappropriate for the chilly autumn night. She didn't seem to feel the cold as she glided toward the car. Martin rolled down the window. "Are you Emily?" The woman nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. Without a word, she opened the back door and slid into the seat directly behind him. The car filled with the faint scent of earth and damp leaves. "Where to?" Martin asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he felt a chill run down his spine. "Just drive," she said softly. Martin hesitated, but put the car in gear. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the fields on either side shrouded in mist. The woman said nothing, her gaze fixed out the window. He tried to make small talk, a habit he had with every passenger. "So, late night out?" he asked, forcing a smile. No response. "Do you live around here?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "I used to." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but something about the way she said it made the hairs on Martin's arms stand on end. He decided to focus on the road. The ride grew more unsettling with each passing mile. The mist thickened, wrapping around the car like a cocoon. The GPS, usually reliable, began glitching, the blue line on the screen jumping erratically. The headlights barely penetrated the fog, and Martin could feel the tension building in his chest. "Are we going the right way?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yes," she replied. "Just keep going." Her tone was calm, almost soothing, but it did nothing to ease his growing unease. The road seemed endless, and the fields on either side looked identical, as if he were driving in circles. Then, out of nowhere, the woman spoke again. "Stop the car." Martin slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the damp pavement. The car came to a halt, and he turned to look at her. "What's wrong?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the mist. Martin watched as she walked to the edge of the road, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She stood there for a moment, motionless, before turning back to him. "Wait here," she said, her voice carrying an edge of authority. Before he could protest, she disappeared into the fog. Minutes passed. Martin sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He rolled down the window, listening for any sound. Footsteps, rustling, anything. But the night was eerily silent. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Leaving the engine running, he grabbed his phone and stepped out of the car. "Emily?" he called, his voice echoing into the void. No response. He walked to the edge of the road, peering into the mist. Shapes seemed to shift in the fog, but he couldn't tell if it was his imagination or something else. "Emily, are you okay?" Still nothing. Suddenly, he heard it. a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere ahead. His heart leapt into his throat as the sound grew louder, closer. Panic took over, and he turned to run back to the car. But when he reached the road, the car was gone. Martin froze, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He spun around, searching for any sign of the vehicle. The road was empty, the mist swallowing everything. Then he heard her voice, soft and distant. "You shouldn't have left the car." He turned toward the sound, and there she was, standing in the middle of the road. But something was different. Her pale skin seemed almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. What do you want?" he stammered. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "To show you the way." Before he could respond, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. The mist thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. His vision blurred, and he felt as though he were falling, the world around him dissolving into shadows. When Martin woke, he was lying on the side of the road, his car idling a few feet away. The sun was rising. The mist burned away by its warmth. He stumbled to his feet, his body aching as if he'd been running for hours. The app on his phone showed the ride as canceled, with no record of a passenger named Emily. Shaken, Martin drove back to the city, vowing never to take another late-night request. But no matter how much he tried to forget, he couldn't shake the memory of her glowing eyes or the chilling promise in her voice. Some roads, he realized, aren't meant to be traveled.